Welcome back. Let's now start to really learn the JavaScript language, starting with values and variables. And let's start by getting rid of some of the code that we have here. So this one here isn't doing anything. And let's also delete this one so that we don't get that annoying pop-up all the time. So in this section, I will be using persons as examples. For example, a person's name, a person's age, or a job. All right. But anyway, let's talk about values now. So a value is basically a piece of data. So it's the most fundamental unit of information that we have in programming. For example, this text, Jonas, is a value. All right. So this here is a value. And again, if we want to actually see this in the console, let's say console.log, and then open up the parentheses, and then close them here, and then the semicolons. So if I save and reload, then of course we get Jonas. Okay? And so Jonas here is the value. Or we can of course have different values. For example here, 23 is the value. Right? And so now we see 23 in the console. And the same is true up here. So in this line of code, where the values are actually 40 and 8 and 23 and 10. So all these four are different values. And then these mathematical operators here join them together to form just one value. And that value is then 61. Okay? And so a value is basically the smallest unit of information that we have in JavaScript. Now, one extremely useful thing that we can do with values is to store them into variables. And so this way, we can reuse them over and over again. For example, we can say let, and then the name of the variable, and then assign a value like Jonas to this variable. Okay? And so what we did here is called declaring a variable. Okay? And so this will actually create a real variable in your computer's memory and will store this value inside of that variable. And actually, that is exactly what we did up here right in the beginning. So here we declared a variable called JS and assigned the value of amazing to that variable. Right? And so now it hopefully makes sense to you what we did back then. So I like to imagine a variable like being a box. So in the real world, a box can hold some object, for example, a book, and we can then write a label on the box to describe what's in it. And then we can find the object later when we need it by using that label. And variables actually work in the exact same way. So here, basically, we have a box called first name. And into that box, we put the value of Jonas. And now, if we want to use this value, all we have to do is to basically use this label. Or in other words, this variable name. So first name in this case. And so let's use it actually. And for that, once again, I will use console.log. And you will see me using console.log throughout this entire course, actually. So whenever we need to output something from our code to the browser, we always use console.log like this. And so here, now, instead of passing a literal value like we did here and here and here, now we can pass in, so we can write here the variable name. So first name. Okay? And if I save it and reload it, let's see what happens. Indeed, we get Jonas. So from line number 8, and so that's right here. And that means that indeed our variable declaration up here worked. And if we now change this to Bob, let's say, then here we should get Bob, right? And indeed, now it's Bob. Let's put it back. And of course, we can now use this variable name many times. So let's just copy and paste this here a couple of times. and give it a save. And so now we have it 3 times. And that means that whenever JavaScript sees this variable name here, it will basically replace it with the original value that we assigned to the variable. So again, that's Jonas. And this is extremely useful, because now if I want to change the first name to something else, I only have to do it in one place. So just here. So let's change it here to Matilda. And if I save it now and reload, of course, it will change in all the 3 places. So this is one of the big advantages of variables. Without variables, I would now have to manually change the value everywhere to Matilda. But like this, everywhere where I reference this variable, it will automatically get changed to Matilda. So that's one of the most important things to keep in mind about variables. Great. And now that we know what a variable is, let's just very quickly talk about conventions and rules for naming variables. Because we shouldn't just give random names to variables. So first, the way that I named this variable here is called camel case. Camel case means that whenever I have multiple words in a variable name, I write the first word with a lowercase and then all the next words with uppercase, like this. So if it was just first, we would write it like this. But if we had more than one word, like first name, person, then you see that all the subsequent words are written with this uppercase letter. And this is kind of a standard in the JavaScript world. But of course, there are other ways of naming variables. For example, we could write first name with an underscore like this. And this is very popular in other languages like Ruby. Or like this, okay? And you can use whatever you like most. Just keep in mind that it's kind of a standard in JavaScript to write variable names like this. So usually, whenever you see other people's code, the variables will usually be written using the camel case notation. So that's kind of a convention of how to name variables in JavaScript. But there are also some actual hard rules in JavaScript about how we can name variables. For example, we cannot write something like this, like 3 years, and set it to the value of 3. So this is an illegal variable name, and VS Code actually warns us right away here. And again, that's because this variable name starts with a number. And if we tried to load this in JavaScript, we would get this error. So that's an invalid or unexpected token here. And it's important to actually start reading these error messages right from the beginning of the course. So we see that this is a so-called syntax error, which means that we did a mistake in writing our code. So that's a mistake in the code's syntax. And we can also see the line where the error occurred, so line 13, so that we can then go ahead and fix it. And notice how this error was shown in the console, even though we didn't use console.log in this case. Okay, so we don't need to use console.log for the console to show errors. All the errors that we make will always end up in the console, and also here with this, error icon. Now anyway, back to our naming conventions here. So we already learned that variable names cannot start with a number. And in fact, variable names can only contain numbers, letters, underscores, or the $sign. So for example, if we try to write Jonas and Matilda equals JM, we would once again get a syntax error, right? And this time it's telling us unexpected token end. And again, that's because this symbol here is illegal in variable names. They can only contain numbers, letters, underscores, or the $sign. So this here, for example, would be allowed. So if we reload now, we get no more errors here. Another error might occur when we try to name a variable using a reserved JavaScript keyword. For example, if we did this, so new, for example, set it to 27, then this would also not be allowed. So you see unexpected token new. And that's because new is a reserved keyword in JavaScript, as we will see a little bit later. And the same goes for something like function. So again, unexpected token here. If we wanted to fix that, we could, for example, start this variable name with an underscore or with the $sign. So that's the only two symbols that are allowed besides letters and numbers. Another variable name that's kind of reserved but still actually allowed to use is the word name. So we could do this and it would actually work, but in some cases this creates some problems because again, this is kind of a reserved keyword, but it's still legal to use. But since it is a keyword, never call your variables just name. Okay, that's why I always call them first name like this. Let's actually get rid of this one because we already have first name up there. Now another convention is that we should not start a variable name with an uppercase letter. So we should not do this. So let person Jonas. Now again, it's a convention, so that's not illegal. It's just that we use this kind of variable names with an uppercase letter for a specific use case in JavaScript, which is object-oriented programming, as we will see later in the course. So for now, never do this, but instead you should write it like this, with a lowercase letter starting. On the same note, variables that are all in uppercase are reserved for constants that we know will never change. For example, the number pi, which is like 3.1415 and so on and so forth. So we know that this number is never going to change, and so that's a constant, and for that we have a convention of writing it in all uppercase. And VS Code actually marks this variable name with a different color, because it knows about this convention that we use. Of course, you could also write it like this, but then this would be kind of weird actually. So if it's a real constant, write it in uppercase like this. So that's a pretty normal convention there in programming as a whole. Finally, to finish this lecture, let's talk about one final convention, which is to make sure that our variable names are descriptive. And that's very important to write cleaner code. So when you name your variables, it should be really easy to understand exactly what value the variable is holding, just by reading the name of the variable. And that's kind of what we did up here by calling this one first name. But let me show you another example. For example, let's say my first job, programmer, and then my current job, teacher. So this is much better than writing this. So job 1, programmer, and job 2, teacher. So which set of variables do you think is more descriptive? Is it these ones or these ones? And I hope that you agree with me that it's much easier to understand what programmer and teacher are in this case here by simply looking at the variable name. So we know that my first job was programmer and that my current job is teacher. While down here, well, we would simply know that these are two different jobs. We don't know anything about them. And so this approach up here is a lot better. So keep that in mind whenever you write your own variable names. And actually keep all of this in mind that we just talked about for naming your variables. Okay? So just to quickly recap what a variable actually is, it is basically a box into which we can store a value. So we give that box a name, which in this case here is first name, or in this case here, it's my first job, for example. And then into that box with that label, we can store a value, which in this case is this programmer string here. Then later in the code, we can reference that variable over and over again. For example, like this. My first job. And if I save this, then of course, here we see programmer. Once again, you probably saw my code changing here automatically from the single quotes to double quotes, but that is just my automatic formatting doing its work. And now if we wanted to change this here, let's say coder, then it would change across the entire program, and now we get coder here. And that's what variables are all about. They're one of the most important things of programming, and so make sure to really understand them before you move on. So in the last lecture, we talked about values and variables. Now, in every programming language, values can have different types, depending on the type of data that we want them to hold. And we already saw strings and numbers, but there are actually more data types. So let's now take a look at all the types that we have in JavaScript. And first of all, in JavaScript, every value is either an object, which looks something like this, or a primitive value. So a value is only a primitive when it's not an object. And we will learn all about objects later, but for now, let's really focus on primitive data types. So there are 7 primitive data types: number, string, boolean, undefined, null, symbol, and big int. So let's look at them one by one. First, we have the number data type. And numbers are always so-called floating point numbers, which means that they always have decimals, even if we don't see them or don't define them. For example, the 23 value that we have here is exactly like having 23.0, but they are both simply the number data type. In many other programming languages, you will find different data types for integers and for decimals, but not in JavaScript. All numbers are simply of the type number. Okay? Next up, we have strings, which are simply a sequence of characters. And so they are just used for text, as we already learned. And always put them in quotes, no matter if double quotes or single quotes. Otherwise, JavaScript will actually confuse them with variable names. The Boolean data type is essentially a logical type that can only take one of the logical values true or false. In other words, a Boolean is always either true or false. Alright? We use Boolean values to take decisions with code, as we will see later. And these are the 3 most important data types that we will deal with the most. But there are still 4 more, which might be a bit more confusing. So first, undefined is the value taken by a variable that is not yet defined. And the variable that's not yet defined is simply just a variable that we declared, but without assigning a value. For example, like this children variable here. So basically, we can say that undefined means empty value. Then there's also null, which is actually pretty similar because it also means empty value, but it's used in different circumstances. But for now, don't worry about the details. I just want you to know that null also exists for now, okay? Anyway, next we have symbol, which was introduced in ES 2015. And this data type is not really useful for us. It simply defines a value that is unique and cannot be changed. And we will talk about this briefly by the end of the course. Finally, starting in ES 2020, there is also big int, which is for integers that are too large to be represented by the number type. So basically, it's another type for numbers, and we will talk about this one in another section. So, these are the 7 primitive data types in JavaScript. But there is another fundamental thing to know about types, which is the fact that JavaScript has a feature called dynamic typing. This means that when you create a new variable, you do not have to manually define the data type of the value that it contains. In many other programming languages, you actually have to do that, but not in JavaScript. Instead, JavaScript automatically determines the data type of a value when it's stored into a variable. And this distinction between value and variable is pretty important, because in JavaScript, it's the value that has a type, not the variable. So variables simply store values that have a type. Many people don't know about this detail or just don't care, but this is how it actually works. Now, another important implication of dynamic typing is that later in our code, we can assign a new value with a different data type to the same variable without a problem. For example, variable x can initially be a number and then later a string. That's not a problem at all. And this can of course be very useful, but it can also be the source of some difficult to find bugs, which means errors in our code. Alright, so let's now actually see these things in action. But before we talk about data types, let's quickly talk about code commenting. So in programming, we use comments to literally comment code or to deactivate code without deleting it. For example, here, I could write a single line comment using // and then I can describe what this code is doing. For example, here I can say variable name conventions. And JavaScript will completely ignore anything that is a comment. So anything that comes after // like this. Okay? And this can be really useful to kind of divide our code into different sections and to explain what different pieces of code are actually doing in our code. So that's a very useful application of comments, but another one is to simply comment out code that we don't want to be executed for some reason. For example, let's say we don't want this code here to be executed, but we also don't want to delete it. So we can simply comment it out like this. And so if I save it, and then when I reload, this 61 should be gone. So you see, that's because JavaScript is now ignoring this code. It's just a comment. But since we didn't delete it, we can of course bring it back. So we can just delete it, and then it's back to normal. Now in VS Code, we can also automatically create comments using the command / shortcut. So that's command or control / to turn on and then again to turn off. So that's single line comments, but we can go even further and also create multi-line comments. And to do that, we do it like this. We start a multi-line comment using / and then asterisk, and then we end it with the asterisk or star and then the /. And whatever comes here is then normal code. Okay? And with this, I effectively got rid of this first code that we typed in the first lecture, but without deleting it. And so I can keep it here basically as a reference. All right? And so that's what I'm going to do in every lecture now. I will always kind of get rid of the previous code by using a multi-line comment like this. But now let's get back to the topic of this lecture, which is data types. So in the previous lecture, we already saw numbers and strings, right? So here we have a value, which is a number, and here we have a value, which is a string. So nothing new, right? That's what we learned at the beginning of the video. But we also talked about booleans, right? And so a boolean is a value that can only be true or false. And so if I write true, that is then automatically a boolean value, which is in this case true. Okay? And actually I can also log that to the console. And then here you get true. And you can see that it's not a string because strings are printed in white. And this value is printed in this pink. And so it's actually really a Boolean value. And of course, we can also store Booleans in variables. So let's say JavaScript is fun. using the camel case notation that we learned about before, and then set it to true. And now we can log JavaScript is fun instead. But of course, the variable declaration here needs to happen before the log. And that's because JavaScript programs are executed from top to bottom like this. And more about that a bit later. Okay? What matters is that this needs to be at the end. So let's cut it and put it here. You can also get rid of this one, save it, and here we still get true. And so here we created a nice and descriptive variable name holding a Boolean value. And remember that it's actually the value that holds the data type and not the variable. Because I could now actually go ahead and change this to a value with another type. And actually I will do that in a second, but for now let's take a look at a special operator called typeOf. So typeOf is an operator just like the plus or the minus operator that we can use to show the type of a value. So let me show you how. So again, we use console.log because we actually want to see the result of this operator in the console. So typeOf, and then let's say just true. Okay? And more about how operators actually work and what they are a bit later in this section. For now, let's just see what happens when we reload this. And we see that it's a Boolean. So just as I said, the result of using this operator here on a value will be a new value, which is a string with the type of this value here. Okay? So let's do that again here. I will copy it just a couple of times. Just like this to make it a bit faster. And so here, let's use JavaScript is fun. And so this should also be a Boolean, but just to make sure. Here, let's now use a number and finally a string. So just to prove you that these are actually numbers and strings. All right. And indeed, we see that JavaScript is fun is a Boolean, 23 is a number, and Jonas is a string. And speaking about strings, I just want to quickly emphasize that we really always need to use quotes in order to create a string. Okay? Let's actually show that here in the console. So we can use double quotes or single quotes, but we really do need quotes in order to create a string. So Jonas, for example, is a string. Okay? And so is Jonas with single quotes. But if we do it like this, then it's not going to work. So it needs to be the same at the beginning and the end. But without any quotes at all, JavaScript will see this as a variable. And so then we get this reference error, which is saying that Jonas is not defined. And that's because it's looking for a variable that does not exist. We never declared a variable called Jonas, right? And so that's why we get this error here. So when you need a string, don't forget the quotes. This is a mistake that I see beginners make all the time, and so really be careful about that. Now, moving on, let's actually see dynamic typing in action. And remember that dynamic typing simply means that we can easily change the type of a value that is held by a variable. So that sounds a bit fancy, but it's really as simple as this. So we already have a variable called JavaScript is fun, and so let's now reassign that variable. So we do that like this. So we write the name of the variable, then equal, and then a new value. And what matters is that we do not write the let here again. So this let keyword. So the first time that we declare a new variable, we need to do it using let. But then when we want to change the value of the variable, we simply write it again like this, but without the let. So we simply assign a new value here to this already existing variable. And this is actually the first time that we did that. And so it's important to understand what happened here. Okay. So again, we first declared a new variable with this name and assigned it this true value. And then down here, we changed the value that is in the variable. So using the box analogy from before, it's like initially putting a book in a box and then later taking the book out of the box and instead putting a phone in the box. And so just like here, we changed the content of the box. In our example here, we changed from true to the string of yes. Okay, and now let's just grab this piece of code here so that we can see that dynamic typing actually works. So if I reload now, then let's see, well, we get here from line 34. Let's actually simplify this here a little bit. So commenting out this code, and I'm using command or control /. Let's reload again. And so you see that initially the type of JavaScript is fun is a Boolean, right? But then we change it to a string down here. And so indeed, when we then test the type of the variable again in line 39, then we get the result of a string. All right. And that basically is dynamic typing. Great. And now let's see an example of undefined. So remember that number, string, and Boolean are the most used data types. But there are more, like undefined and null, and also symbol and big int. But in this lecture, I'm only going to talk about the three most important ones, and then also undefined and null. So remember that undefined is the value taken by a variable that is not yet defined. So basically undefined means an empty value. So it's perfectly legal in JavaScript to do this. So to define a variable without a value. And if we now take a look at this variable, then we should see undefined. And actually, let's also check the type so that I can show you something. Year. Okay. And so you get both undefined. What this means is that whenever we declare an empty variable, the value of the variable will be undefined and the type of the variable is also undefined. Now that maybe sounds a bit confusing, but it's really not. So simply put, undefined is both the value and the type of the value. And undefined is different than other types in this way. But this detail is not really important. What matters is that when you declare an empty variable like this, it will automatically hold the value of undefined. And that's why we got undefined here. Then, just like before, we can also reassign this variable basically. So we can now go ahead and say year 1991. And once more, without the let, because we are not creating a new variable. We are simply assigning a new value to year. So it used to be undefined, right? As we just discussed. And now I'm changing it to 1991. And so if I test for the type now again, it should now be a number, right? So let's check that. And indeed, we can again see the effect of dynamic typing. Great. And now finally, just to quickly finish, I want to show you an error that exists in the type of operator. So all I'm going to do here is to quickly say console.log type of null. So remember that null is just another data type and it's similar to undefined. And it's also similar in the fact that both the value and the type of the value are null. Okay, now about this bug, JavaScript says that the type of null is an object, and this doesn't make any sense at all. And so this is regarded as a bug or an error in JavaScript. However, this bug is never corrected for legacy reasons. But null is of course not an object. This should return null, just as type of undefined returns undefined. So just keep that in mind when working with type of, but we will also come back to this later in the course to make sure that you don't create any accidental bugs because of this weird behavior. Okay, and that's all I had to tell you about data types in JavaScript. Let's now take a look at the 3 different ways of declaring variables in JavaScript. So up until this point, we have always used the let keyword to declare variables. However, there are also const and var. Now, let and const were introduced in ES6, and so they are modern JavaScript, while the var keyword is the old way of declaring variables. So let's learn how they are different and which one to use in which situations. And let's again start by getting rid of this code. Actually, all I will do is move this to the end. And in the future, I will just do this before recording the next video. So anyway, we use the let keyword to declare variables that can change later. So basically during the execution of our program. And that's exactly what we did here. So we used let to declare JavaScript is fun, and then we changed that later from true to yes. Right? For example, or another example I would say is, let's set the age to 30 at one point of the program, and then in another point of the program, we can change it to something else. For example, when the person turns 31. And then the age, of course, changes from 30 to 31. And so it's perfectly okay to declare a variable with let at one point in the program and then later assign a new value to it. In technical terms, we call this reassigning a value to a variable, or also we say that we mutate the age variable in this case. So it was 30 and now it's 31. And so we mutated the variable. Okay, so that's a term that you will hear all the time in the JavaScript world. So when we need to mutate a variable, that's the perfect use case for using let. And that also counts for the case that we want to declare empty variables. So for example, as we did here, where we declared an empty year and then later reassigned that variable to 1991. And sometimes we actually do this in practice. For example, when we want to declare all the variables at the top of a file, but only assign actual values to them later in the program, for example, based on some condition. Now, on the other hand, we use the const keyword to declare variables that are not supposed to change at any point in the future. So the value in a const variable cannot be changed. For example, let's say the birth year, 1991, for example. If we then tried to reassign that, let's say to 1990, it should not work. So let's test that. And indeed, we get a type error. So assignment to constant variable. And so that's exactly what the const keyword does. It creates a variable that we cannot reassign, or in technical terms, an immutable variable. So a variable that cannot be mutated. Okay? And the birth year is a perfect example for that, because in fact, the birth year of a person can never change, while the age, of course, can change. And so that's why we used let for the age and const for the birth year. Okay? That makes sense? Now, the fact that variables created with const are immutable also means that we cannot declare empty const variables. For example, this is not legal. So let's comment out this one here, again with command or control slash, so that it doesn't get in our way here. And then reload, and then we get an error, missing initializer in const declaration. And so this error message means that when using const, we need basically an initial value. All right, so just like here. Now, with these two different ways of declaring variables, you will probably ask, should I use let or should I use const to declare a new variable? Well, as a best practice for writing clean code, I always recommend to use const by default and let only when you are really sure that the variable needs to change at some point in the future. For example, when you have a variable that's really never supposed to change, like this birth year, you should always use const. Also, if you are sure that the age variable is never changing inside your program, you should declare it using const as well. The reason for this is that it's a good practice to have as little variable mutations or variable changes as possible, because changing variables introduces a potential to create bugs, so basically errors in your code. So again, by default, always just use const, and let when you're sure that the value of the variable needs to change at some point in your code. And so from now on, I will probably use the const way of declaring variables as much as possible. Now, there's also a third way in JavaScript of declaring variables, which is the var keyword. But this one should actually be completely avoided, okay? However, we should still know how it works for legacy reasons, because you will see this maybe in older code bases or some older tutorials that you find online. So let's take a look at how it works. So var is basically the old way of defining variables prior to ES6. And at first sight, it works actually pretty much the same as let. So we can write var job equals programmer, and then just like with let, we can change the value of the variable later. Just like this. Let's take this one out and let's just reload. And we didn't get any errors, which means that it's basically allowed to mutate this job variable when we use var, right? Now, although it looks like var and let are very similar, below the surface they're actually pretty different. And actually there are also many differences between let, const and var. So between all three of them. And you will learn all about these differences later in section 7, because this is actually really important stuff. And I know that I keep saying that you will learn some topics later in the course, but the truth is that learning is really not linear. It cannot happen in a linear way. So you sometimes need more advanced things right now, even without understanding them. But that's no problem, because you will understand them eventually. So right now, it would really not be useful for you to know that let is block scoped and that var is function scoped, right? Because you don't even know what a block or what a function really is. And so we will learn about these differences in section 7. For now, what matters is that you should basically never use var, okay? Now, just to finish, some people will probably point out that we actually don't even have to declare variables at all, because it's actually not mandatory. We can just write something like this. Last name equals Schmedtmann, in my case. And then we can just use this variable name, in this case by logging it to the console, and JavaScript will happily execute this script even without us declaring the variable, right? We didn't use let, nor const, nor var in this case, but it still worked. However, this is actually a pretty terrible idea, because this doesn't create the variable in the current so-called scope. Instead, JavaScript will create a property on the global object. And once again, you will understand a little bit later what all of this means. But what matters is that you should always properly declare variables, okay? Never just write a variable like this without really declaring it. Great, you're doing great progress here, even though our code doesn't really do anything yet, and we're not really writing any real applications yet, right? But we still need to get some fundamentals down before we can do that. And so that's really important. And that's why I'm stressing all the little details about everything here. And I hope you see how important that is for your progress. Okay? And don't worry, we will get to the cool stuff even a bit later in this first section. Okay? But for now, in the next video, let's talk about operators in JavaScript.